Hey guys, tonight we begin with medieval Europe, a time when perfectly normal behaviours were treated as undeniable proof you'd lost your mind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the Middle Ages, daydreaming wasn't just suspicious. It was practically an invitation for the Inquisition to show up at your doorstep with a bucket of holy water and the energy of a man who hasn't blinked since Tuesday. If your eyes drifted anywhere other than soil, scripture, or unpaid taxes, people assumed you'd mentally wandered into hell's customer service lobby. Picture yourself as a medieval peasant. You've spent the morning breaking rocks, hauling mud, or doing whatever vague, back-destroying activity counts as a normal Tuesday. Your body is begging for retirement at age 19. Naturally, your brain tries to escape. It slips away, just for a moment, to imagine eating bread that isn't mostly gravel, or sleeping past sunrise, or having a second shirt. Congratulations. You have just committed thought crime. Because in the medieval worldview, no one simply zones out. If you stared off into space, it meant one of two things. A demon was whispering in your ear. You were whispering back. And trust me, medieval villagers watched for this. These people had nothing else to do. There was no TV, no hobbies, no psychotherapy. Their favourite pastime was diagnosing each other with spiritual corruption based on facial expressions. You blinked too slowly? Possessed. You blinked too fast? Also possessed. You blinked normally? Suspiciously normal. Priests especially hated daydreaming. To them, the mind was a battlefield, and the devil was just waiting for you to get bored during chores. The moment you paused mid-shovel, Father Gregory slid into frame like a medieval jump scare, shouting, "What enters your thoughts, child?" Nothing clears your mind faster than a priest interrogating you at top volume. Children were monitored too. If a kid stared at a butterfly, adults assumed the child was listening to fairy voices. If a kid stared at the floor, they assumed elves were trying to recruit him. Basically, medieval parents believed their children were one long blink away from joining a supernatural cult. Even nobles weren't safe. A prince who gazed dramatically out of a window was described as melancholic. A princess who got lost in thought was diagnosed with sorrow vapours, which sounds fancy but is actually medieval code for "we don't know what's wrong, fetch a bucket." So yes, daydreaming. Perfectly normal today. A major spiritual red flag in medieval Europe. In a world where people bathed twice a year and settled medical debates by bleeding you with a rusty tool, the quiet act of drifting into your own mind was considered the most dangerous thing you could do. In the Middle Ages, talking to yourself was not a charming quirk, nor was it a sign of a creative mind at work. It was a crisis, a catastrophe, a spiritual emergency that required at least 3 priests, a bucket of holy water, and a neighbour who claimed she once saw the Virgin Mary in her chicken coop. Medieval people didn't believe in harmless self-dialogue. Nobody was working through their thoughts. Nobody was practicing a speech. If your lips moved and there was no audience, the assumption was immediate and dramatic. You were having a conversation with something that wasn't human. Imagine a medieval villager spotting their neighbour mumbling to themselves while sweeping the dirt floor. They didn't think, "Poor guy, long week." No. They thought, "He's possessed, and also we should probably stop letting him borrow our tools." The human brain was not trusted to produce thoughts without supervision. Any sign that you were holding an internal debate meant the debate partner was likely supernatural and deeply untrustworthy. Priests were especially vigilant about this. They believed demons were excellent conversationalists, smooth talkers who loved slipping ideas into the minds of the vulnerable. So if you were overheard whispering something like, "Where did I put that spoon?" medieval clergy didn't hear confusion. They heard, "O great and terrible spirit, guide my hand." Suddenly, you were scheduled for a cleansing ritual, featuring chanting, candles, and at least one bystander who fainted on cue. It got worse for people who worked alone. Shepherds, woodcutters, millers, anyone whose job required solitude was under constant suspicion. If someone saw you talking to yourself on a lonely hill while watching sheep, they didn't assume boredom. They assumed you were receiving dark pastoral wisdom from goat-shaped entities. Even the sheep probably judged you. Some people tried to hide it. They would cough mid-sentence or pretend to be humming a tune. But medieval villagers were experts at paranoia. They would listen closely, squint dramatically, and whisper to others that you were uttering forbidden words. Once that rumour started, good luck. In a world with no entertainment, gossip was both social currency and a sport. The medieval mind believed silence was safety. Words spoken to nobody were invitations, and anyone who invited invisible forces into the conversation was not considered eccentric, stressed, or creative. They were considered spiritually leaky, dangerously open-minded, and in need of immediate, forceful intervention. Talking to yourself today means you're human. Talking to yourself in medieval Europe meant you were no longer fully human. In the Middle Ages, laughter was not a private activity. Medieval laughter was supposed to be communal, public, and ideally caused by someone slipping in mud, being chased by livestock, or falling off something they had no business climbing. Laughter without spectacle was unimaginable. So if someone laughed alone, without permission, without witnesses, and worst of all, without an obvious reason, villagers reacted as though the person had just sprouted horns. Picture a medieval street, grey, muddy, cold, smelling faintly of animals that definitely should not be indoors. Everyone is tired, everyone is underpaid, and everyone's knees hurt. Then suddenly, from somewhere, you hear a lone laugh, soft to yourself, at something in your own head. Perhaps you remembered a joke someone told you at the alehouse. Perhaps you momentarily imagined a world where your roof didn't leak. Either way, the damage is done. Medieval villagers freeze mid-step like deer who've just spotted the world's least subtle wolf. To them, laughter wasn't just a sound, it was a symptom. People did not laugh out of joy. Joy was uncommon, unnatural, and frankly suspicious. Medieval Europe was a place where happiness needed justification, preferably a public disaster or a neighbour's misfortune. Laughter that came from within, from thought, memory, or imagination, meant something had bypassed the normal order of suffering. Something had touched you. Something invisible. So you, the lone laugher, instantly became a case study in spiritual instability. A monk passing by would narrow his eyes, clutching his rosary the way modern people clutch pepper spray. A villager might back away slowly, assuming you were communing with unseen spirits who found things funny that regular humans didn't. God forbid it was nighttime. Laughing alone after sunset was essentially the medieval equivalent of announcing, "I'm absolutely possessed, and would like everyone to panic now." Priests especially hated solitary laughter. They believed demons had a sense of humour, dark, twisted, and aimed entirely at the vulnerable. So if you laughed alone, clergy assumed the devil had told you a joke, and you had been rude enough to laugh at it. Next thing you knew, the priest was sprinkling holy water on you like he was seasoning a roast chicken. Even worse, laughter could spread. If one person laughed alone, others might become curious, maybe even amused, and medieval authorities could not allow joy to become contagious. That way lay rebellion. So in medieval Europe, laughing to yourself didn't mean you were happy. It meant you were marked, touched, or temporarily rented out by something supernatural. Your joy was never yours. It was either demonic or dangerous. In modern times, crying for no reason is normal. Sometimes you're tired. Sometimes you're overwhelmed. Sometimes you watched a sad dog video at the wrong hour. But in medieval Europe, emotional nuance wasn't a thing. If a tear left your eye without a visible, obvious, publicly acceptable reason behind it, people assumed your soul was experiencing technical difficulties. To a medieval villager, sadness was supposed to be predictable. Your crops failed? Cry. Your roof collapsed during a storm and the goat refused to leave your bed? Cry. Your third child this winter got a fever and mysteriously turned blue. Cry. Those were the rules. Tears were a scheduled ritual, neatly aligned with external disasters. But if you cried while doing something ordinary, fetching water, sweeping the floor, or aggressively stirring a pot of something that smelled like regret, people didn't interpret it as emotional overwhelm. They interpreted it as spiritual leakage. Something inside you had cracked open, and nobody wanted to see what would spill out. Imagine being in a medieval marketplace. You're overwhelmed, exhausted, and someone bumps you with a sack of onions the size of a pillow. A small tear escapes, a tiny shimmer of human vulnerability. Instantly, a fishmonger freezes mid-gutting, a monk drops his bread ration, and an elderly woman clutches her chest like she's about to faint dramatically, even though she's done this 5 times already this week. Everyone stares as if you've just transformed into a werewolf. In their minds, you weren't sad. You were afflicted. Medieval physicians, who were basically astrologers with knives, believed unexplained crying came from melancholic humours. These humours were mysterious fluids that supposedly sloshed around inside your body and sometimes needed to be drained with a sharp object. If someone cried inexplicably, the physician would arrive with a leech bucket and the confidence of a man who has absolutely no idea what he's doing. Priests had their own theories. To them, sudden tears meant a demon had hopped onto your chest like a cat and squeezed your heart for fun. They saw crying not as emotion but as supernatural pressure release. They'd rush over with holy water, mumbling prayers while you tried to explain you were just overwhelmed by life, exhaustion, and the smell of medieval hygiene. Even family members panicked. If you cried too often, your relatives began to treat you like unstable glassware, fragile, cursed, and always on the brink of publicly embarrassing them. So yes, crying for no reason wasn't seen as human. It wasn't seen as emotional. It was seen as an indicator that your soul had sprung a leak and the devil was ready to crawl out. In the Middle Ages, privacy was not a concept. It was not a right, a preference, or a mood. Privacy simply did not exist. The average medieval villager lived in a one-room house that contained an entire family, a goat, 3 chickens, the winter grain, and occasionally a neighbour who fell asleep after drinking too much ale. If you wanted alone time, you were either royalty or dead. So if someone expressed even the slightest desire to be alone, just a quiet moment away from the chaos, they weren't seen as introspective. They were seen as deeply suspicious. Wanting privacy meant something was wrong with you, the kind of wrong that made priests sweat. Imagine stepping outside for a breath of fresh air, trying to collect your thoughts after a day of mud, noise, and human proximity. You wander towards the edge of the village, staring at the trees, enjoying the wind. Within minutes, 2 villagers have spotted you, exchanged dramatic glances, and notified the nearest person of authority, who, in the medieval world, was usually a guy who owned a hat. "What's he doing out there all alone?" they'd whisper. "Why is he thinking by himself? What does he need privacy for?" The answer in their minds was never peace. It was always dark rituals, soul corruption, or talking to forest spirits, which were somehow worse than demons, because at least demons had manners. Privacy meant secrecy. Secrecy meant danger, and danger meant witchcraft. If you were caught alone too often, people assumed you had wandered off to converse with supernatural beings, and the medieval imagination was creative. The forest was full of creatures waiting to recruit lonely humans. Fairies, spirits, demons, elves, basically anyone with magical abilities and no regard for personal boundaries. Even wanting space indoors was suspicious. If you sat in a corner alone, staring at the fire, someone eventually asked if you were feeling touched. Not by emotion, by invisible fingers from the beyond. If you closed the door behind you, villagers assumed you were hiding something. If you went for a walk without announcing it, the entire village invented 3 separate conspiracy theories before you returned. The irony, of course, is that privacy might have preserved what little sanity medieval people had left. But in their eyes, solitude wasn't healing. It was risky. dangerous. A sign you might be slipping out of the community's grip and into the waiting hands of whatever creatures lurked in their imagination. Wanting space meant you were different. And in medieval Europe, being different was the first step toward being damned. If there was one thing medieval people feared more than famine, plague, or stepping on something sharp in the dark, it was the idea that someone's sleep schedule didn't align with the village's collective misery. Sleep, in their eyes, wasn't just rest. It was a spiritual battleground. So if you slept too much, too little, at the wrong time, or looked like you'd enjoyed any part of it, the diagnosis was swift. You were cursed. Imagine a medieval morning. Everyone wakes up at dawn because the rooster screams aggressively into everyone's windowless homes, like he's personally offended by their existence. The entire village rises with the sun, begrudgingly dragging themselves out of straw beds that feel like sleeping on regret. But then there's you. You oversleep, for once in your bleak, exhausting life, and suddenly you're the talk of the village. He slept past sunrise. Past sunrise? Past sunrise. A collective gasp. Someone nearly faints. Sleeping too much meant demons had cradled you through the night. Not kindly, more like possessively. Medieval doctors wrote confidently and incorrectly that long sleep allowed dark spirits to sit upon the lungs, which sounds dramatic, but was probably just snoring. People believed demons loved latching onto the lazy, and nothing screamed lazy like getting 8 full hours. On the other hand, insomnia was even worse. If you woke up in the night, couldn't sleep, or spent too much time staring at the ceiling imagining a better life, everyone assumed something had woken you, and that something was not friendly. Medieval folklore is full of creatures that visited you in your sleep. Night hags, demons, elves, spirits, and relatives you owed money. If someone heard you pacing at night, they didn't think, "Poor guy can't sleep." They thought, "He's being tormented by demons trying to drag him out of bed." A restless night was interpreted as spiritual warfare, not anxiety about crop failure, or the fact that you share a room with 10 other people and a goat with insomnia. Deviation from the normal sleep pattern, aka collapse at sundown, wake at dawn, repeat until death, was terrifying to them. They believed a person's sleep reflected their soul. Too much sleep meant corruption. Too little sleep meant the forces of darkness were nibbling at your consciousness like medieval rats at grain bags. So whether you slept deeply, slept poorly, or simply wanted a nap, medieval people saw you the same way. Spiritually compromised, suspiciously misaligned with the natural order, and possibly halfway to becoming a wandering ghost. Sleep wasn't restorative. Sleep was a liability. In medieval Europe, happiness wasn't a natural human emotion. It was an anomaly, an unexpected glitch in the system that immediately triggered concern, suspicion, and at least one prayer whispered under someone's breath. The average medieval person lived under a consistent cloud of hunger, cold, taxes, and the unsettling knowledge that death could be hiding behind any random puddle. So if you smiled without a visible cause, people didn't think, "He's in a good mood today." They thought, "Something has gone terribly, unnaturally wrong." Picture yourself walking through a medieval village, smiling faintly because the sun is out for once, and the mud only goes up to your ankles today instead of your knees. A normal moment of human optimism. But to the villagers, you look like someone who's been touched by otherworldly forces. A woman selling onions pauses mid-shout, the blacksmith lowers his hammer in confusion, and an elderly man crossing the road clutches his rosary as if your cheerfulness might be contagious. Joy, especially spontaneous joy, was deeply suspicious. Medieval culture valued suffering as a spiritual exercise. Misery meant humility. Pain meant closeness to God. Cheerfulness, that meant you had clearly made some kind of deal. The kind of deal people whispered about after dark while trying not to make eye contact with the forest. Even laughter was policed. If a villager laughed too loudly, too freely, or too often, the priest began making notes. Medieval priests were essentially therapists with no training and a strong bias toward diagnosing everything as the devil. So if you walked into the tavern grinning, the bartender didn't smile back. He blinked rapidly, stepped away from you, and mentally reviewed whether he had enough holy water behind the counter. Children were even more vulnerable to this paranoia. If a child ran around laughing, villagers often assumed a fairy had enchanted the kid, or that the child was destined for a dramatic downfall involving a curse, a prophecy, or a mysterious disappearance. Children weren't supposed to be happy. They were supposed to be small, terrified adults with chores. Even nobles weren't immune. A joyful noblewoman might be declared overheated in the humours, which is medieval for she smiled too much, drain some blood until her personality stabilises. A cheerful knight could be accused of pride, vanity, or excessive warmth in the brain. In short, happiness had consequences. It wasn't celebrated, it was interrogated. People didn't ask, "Why are you so happy?" They asked, "What dark power gave you permission to feel this way?" Joy wasn't a blessing. It was a medieval red flag waving violently in the wind. In the Middle Ages, music was never a private experience. It was loud, communal, slightly chaotic, and usually off-key. You heard music at festivals, weddings, funerals, and drunken gatherings, where half the participants were singing one song and the other half were shouting an entirely different one. Medieval music was a group activity, not a personal one, because personal enjoyment of anything was generally frowned upon. So the idea of someone sitting alone, listening to music, really listening, quietly, peacefully, was deeply unsettling to medieval eyes. If they saw a person humming to themselves while tending animals, or tapping a foot gently while walking to the marketplace, villagers didn't think, enjoying a tune. They thought, someone has enchanted him, and it's only a matter of time before he wanders into the woods and never returns. Music was believed to carry power. Not artistic power, supernatural power. Songs were thought to attract spirits, fairies, and the occasional demon looking for a fun night out. If you enjoyed music alone, you were inviting something mystical to join you, like an unwise host leaving their door open. Medieval people had a strong fear of things that could enter unnoticed. This included wolves, neighbours, and supernatural beings with questionable intentions. Picture a medieval villager sitting alone in a field, humming softly while weaving baskets. A perfectly harmless scene, but to anyone watching, alarm bells go off instantly. A shepherd might drop his staff. A passing monk might cross himself so dramatically he nearly falls over. A local woman might hurry home to inform the priest that someone is experiencing musical visitation, which in medieval vocabulary meant the devil is trying to make him dance. Even instruments were dangerous in solitary hands. A person playing a flute alone in their hut was practically begging for rumours. The flute, after all, was frequently associated with wild forest spirits and seduction, two things medieval people deeply feared because they had absolutely no defences against either. If someone dared to close their eyes while enjoying the melody, that was it. Closing one's eyes to music wasn't relaxation, it was trance. It meant you were entering the kind of state only saints, sorcerers, and the spiritually unstable attempted. A villager caught with shut eyes and a pleasant expression was halfway to an exorcism. In short, music was fine, but only if enjoyed loudly, badly, and with as many witnesses as possible. Anything else suggested enchantment, corruption, or impending doom. Because in medieval Europe, harmony didn't soothe the soul. It summoned suspicion. In the Middle Ages, nighttime wasn't just the part of the day when it's dark. It was a full spiritual hazard zone. After sunset, villages transformed into ominous sets from a horror film directed by someone who hated humanity. The darkness belonged to ghosts, demons, wandering spirits, witches, wolves, and whatever else people invented to make themselves feel even worse about their lives. So if someone was caught walking outside at night, voluntarily, they weren't just suspicious. They were practically volunteering to join the local supernatural population. Imagine a medieval villager stepping outside for a late-night walk, maybe to clear their head after a long day of agricultural suffering. They push open the wooden door, take a single step into the darkness, and instantly, Instantly, every curtain in every nearby hut twitches. Eyes peer out like owls, whispers slither across the street, and somewhere a dog growls because it too knows something unholy is occurring. No sane person would willingly go outside after dark. Only two kinds of beings did that: lunatics and creatures with glowing eyes. The medieval world believed that the veil between the living and the dead grew thin at night. Spirits roamed freely, demons prowled, and fairies dragged unsuspecting humans into their strange night parades. So if you were spotted wandering alone, villagers assumed you were either communing with those forces or being lured by them. The idea that you might just enjoy silence or need a break from your own household was never considered. A monk catching you outside at night might genuinely believe that you'd been seduced by a demon. Not metaphorically seduced, literally seduced, possibly in a field. Night demons were believed to be extremely charismatic, and medieval villagers were convinced that even the most average-looking farmer could be kidnapped by one if he so much as stepped outside for air. Even your own family would panic. If you slipped out after dark, they didn't assume you went for a thoughtful stroll. They assumed you had been possessed, enchanted, cursed, bewitched, or temporarily kidnapped by forces unknown. And when you returned home, your loved ones would question you the same way modern police question suspects. Gently at first, then aggressively, then with holy water. If you claimed you just needed to think, medieval people would blink slowly and respond, "No one thinks at night." That's when the thinking creatures roam. Night was for hiding indoors, praying quietly, and pretending you weren't afraid. Anyone wandering outside was clearly at the mercy of something unnatural. In the medieval world, reading was not a hobby. It wasn't relaxing, it wasn't admirable, and it certainly wasn't encouraged. Reading, in the eyes of most medieval villagers, was something that only three types of people engaged in: priests, scribes, and unfortunate children locked in monasteries. If you, a normal person, picked up a book and started reading for pleasure, that was basically the psychological equivalent of spontaneously growing horns. Books themselves were already suspicious. They were expensive, rare, and written in Latin, the official language of people who didn't want you to understand anything. A book wasn't something you casually owned. It was something you inherited after 4 generations of monks died in the same monastery, leaving behind exactly one dusty manuscript about turnip farming, or the moral dangers of smiling too much. So when someone in a medieval village developed an appetite for reading, people paid attention. Curious attention. Alarmed attention. The kind of attention normally reserved for strange lights in the forest or livestock, giving birth to something with extra legs. Imagine a medieval peasant sitting outside with a book. Immediately, neighbours begin to gather at a safe distance, whispering as if they've just spotted a rare demon in its natural habitat. What is he doing? He's staring at symbols. Is he trying to summon something? It looks like words. Oh God, he's a thinker. The more you read, the worse it got. If you were seen turning pages too quickly, villagers assumed you were absorbing dangerous knowledge. Knowledge that might lead to questions. Questions were the greatest threat to medieval society. Because if one person questioned anything, soon neighbours might start wondering why all their taxes go to a local baron who hasn't worked a day in his life. Priests, surprisingly, were not fans of amateur readers either. Yes, they read constantly, but that was different. They read approved things. Things with saints and plagues and dire warnings. If you, a layperson, picked up a manuscript that wasn't religious, the priest's eyes would narrow into slits. You might hear him mutter something like, "The devil enters through literacy," while gripping his rosary harder than necessary. Women reading was even worse. A woman who read too much was mysterious, unpredictable, and almost certainly dangerous. She might learn something. She might think something. She might, heaven forbid, realize how terrible men's hygiene truly was and revolt. Reading privately, frequently, or joyfully marked you as mentally unstable, or worse, intellectually curious. In the medieval mind, there was no real difference. In medieval Europe, Choosing to drink water was one of the clearest possible signs that something was mentally wrong with you. Not metaphorically wrong. Literally, medically, spiritually, cosmically wrong. Water was seen as a last resort, the beverage equivalent of scraping mould off old bread and pretending it was seasoning. So if you willingly reached for a cup of plain, unboiled, untreated, suspiciously cloudy medieval water, the village didn't worry for you. They worried about you. The medieval world was built on beer. Weak beer, strong beer, expensive beer, questionable beer that tasted vaguely like hay. Didn't matter. Beer was hydration. Beer was tradition. Beer was survival. Beer was the medieval version of a multivitamin. You took it because everything else would kill you. Water, on the other hand, was a microbial carnival. It flowed through villages picking up disease like a collectible hobby, and somehow always smelled faintly of livestock, even when no livestock were involved. So imagine this. You're working in a field on a hot day, sweating out what little joy you have left. The other peasants pull out small jugs of ale, the safe, trusted medieval beverage. And then there's you, reaching confidently for a ladle of water from the communal bucket. Every face turns toward you. A man drops his hoe. A woman gasps so loudly her own chicken runs away. A child stares like he's watching someone attempt sorcery with the wrong ingredients. To them, no sane person chose water. Choosing water meant you either misunderstood basic survival, or you were actively trying to die. And medieval people, who saw death daily but still had an impressive talent for overreacting, immediately assumed you needed intervention. Your friends might gently pull your hand away from the bucket. Your family might insist you lie down and rest your humours. Old women would murmur that your brain must have boiled in the sun. Someone would fetch a priest, just in case the devil had convinced you to sabotage your own hydration. Priests weren't much calmer. They believed demons sometimes urged people to harm themselves subtly, and nothing was more subtle or suicidal than choosing medieval water over medieval beer. A priest witnessing such a scene might immediately sprinkle you with holy water, ironically, water they would never drink, and pray loudly to drown out the gossip forming around you. In the medieval mind, beer kept you alive, but water revealed you'd already lost the plot. Anyone who reached for water voluntarily was either cursed, delirious, dangerously naive, or clearly suffering a mental collapse of impressive proportions. Drinking water wasn't refreshing. It was alarming. In medieval Europe, being kind to animals wasn't considered sweet or compassionate. It wasn't seen as a sign of a gentle soul or a future veterinarian, a job that did not exist, unless you count guy who guesses what's wrong with your cow. No. Kindness toward animals was one of the fastest ways to earn the label of witch, heretic, or person who definitely has a pact with something that lives in the woods. Animals in the medieval world weren't pets. They were tools, food sources, or background noise. Cats existed to kill mice, dogs existed to bark at things, and chickens existed to scream at dawn like small feathered alarms. So when someone treated an animal with unusual affection, stroking its fur, speaking to it softly, feeding it scraps from their own meagre meal, villagers did not interpret this as empathy. They interpreted it as sorcery. Imagine someone feeding a stray cat, a normal, harmless act today. But in a medieval village, a cat accepting food from your hand was basically a supernatural contract. People would freeze mid-step. They'd whisper. They'd point. Cats were already considered suspicious because they acted like they understood too much and respected too little. If a cat trusted you, that meant something dark was guiding it. No animal with sense would willingly get close to a human in medieval Europe unless coaxed by magic. Dogs weren't much better. If a dog followed you around the village, people didn't think, that's adorable. They thought, he controls beasts. Heaven help us. A loyal dog was suspicious because loyalty required emotional connection, and emotional connection required free time, something medieval peasants absolutely did not have. The idea that someone had the leisure to bond with an animal instead of labouring endlessly was unnatural in itself. And heaven forbid you talk to an animal. Whisper to a horse for comfort? Witchcraft. Complaint to a chicken while collecting eggs? demon communication. Share your personal struggles with a goat during a moment of weakness? You've basically confessed to the village that you have one foot in an unholy dimension. Even worse was the concept of rescuing an animal. If you took in an injured bird or nursed a sick dog back to health, villagers assumed you were practicing forbidden healing arts. Only God, saints, and questionable barber surgeons were allowed to heal anything. If an animal recovered because of you, people became very nervous. Because in medieval Europe, kindness wasn't kindness. Kindness was influence. Influence was power. And power, especially over animals, was terrifying. Being gentle to creatures didn't mean you had a good heart. It meant you were one broomstick away from a witch trial. In medieval Europe, collecting herbs was not a wholesome pastime. It was not a relaxing hobby, a harmless interest in botany, or the medieval equivalent of, I like gardening because it helps my anxiety. No. Picking herbs, any herbs for any reason, was one of the quickest ways to convince your neighbours you had a direct line to the devil. Nothing unnerved medieval villagers more than someone who knew what plants did. The typical medieval relationship to nature was fear. Plants were mysterious. Some cured things, some killed things, and most did absolutely nothing except taste like a handful of dirt. So anyone who wandered around the woods or meadows with purpose, kneeling, sniffing, examining leaves, muttering to themselves, looked less like a gardener and more like someone gathering ingredients for a midnight ritual. Imagine a medieval woman kneeling in a field at dawn, gently clipping rosemary. Perfectly innocent. She's just trying to season her 4-ingredient stew, which is 80% barley, 10% hope, and 10% dirt. But to the villagers who spot her from a distance, the scene looks dramatically different. They see a lone figure, crouched in mist, collecting strange greenery, like she's preparing an unholy potion. By the time she stands up, half the town has already agreed she's at least 80% witch. Even the simplest plants triggered suspicion. Chamomile for sleep. Clearly she's trying to induce visions. Thyme for cooking? Obviously she's crafting a spell to weaken a rival. Peppermint for stomach aches? A healing potion, illegal unless performed by someone with a vague title like local healer, barber surgeon, or elderly woman who once saw a miracle but might have been hallucinating. The irony is that medieval healers themselves used herbs constantly, but because healers were officially allowed to look eccentric, their herbal knowledge was tolerated. Anyone outside that tiny circle, however, was suspicious. A peasant man collecting herbs meant he was dabbling in forbidden practices. A peasant woman collecting herbs meant she was already halfway to a bonfire. Even drying herbs indoors raised alarms. Bundles of plants hanging from your ceiling might be perfectly practical, unless you were medieval. Then they were ominous warning signs. Neighbours would glance into your window, see the bundles, and immediately assume you were in contact with beings who only appeared after midnight. Herbs weren't plants. They were evidence. Evidence that you knew things you were not supposed to know. In medieval Europe, owning a functional knowledge of nature made you dangerous. Using it made you guilty. And enjoying it? Well, that was witchcraft beyond dispute. In medieval Europe, being left-handed was not a harmless biological quirk. It was a lifestyle threat, a spiritual misalignment, a glaring sign that you had entered the world already suspicious. Even the language betrayed you. The Latin word for left was sinister, which medieval people took far too literally. If your dominant hand happened to be the wrong one, congratulations, you were automatically guilty of something. They just hadn't figured out what yet. Imagine being a medieval child and instinctively grabbing a spoon, or more likely a chunk of stale bread, with your left hand. Your mother gasps like she's witnessed a murder. Your father blinks at you as though you've grown antlers. The village priest, who has been watching for signs of corruption in every newborn since dawn, suddenly appears behind you with the stealth of a cat and the anxiety of a man who thinks demons personally hate him. The problem wasn't the hand itself, it was what the hand implied. Medieval people saw the world as a cosmic tug-of-war between God and the devil, both fighting over your soul like two drunks fighting over the last piece of cheese. And if you used your left hand more than your right, that suggested the devil was winning. Not because of any evidence, of course, but because medieval logic was built entirely on panic and superstition. Teachers were the worst offenders. If you were unlucky enough to attend a medieval school, your teacher's job was simple: force every child to write with the correct hand or die trying. A left-handed student was not encouraged or understood. They were disciplined, physically, dramatically, and often loudly. Teachers would smack your left hand with sticks, tie it behind your back, or lecture you about the dangers of evil symmetry. It didn't matter that writing with your right hand made your letters look like they'd been drawn by a tipsy goose. What mattered was conformity. Even daily tasks were suspicious. Stir a pot with your left hand, and someone would comment that the stew now tasted unsettled. Pet a cat with your left hand, and villagers would mutter that the animal was now bewitched. Hold a tool, carry a bucket, or greet someone using that cursed hand, and people would subconsciously recoil, unsure whether to fear you or pity you. Left-handedness was seen as a flaw, a threat, and a cosmic inconvenience. Not because it hurt anyone, far from it, but because medieval people didn't know what to do with anything different. And if there was one thing medieval Europe feared more than demons, plagues, and bad weather, it was difference. In the Middle Ages, calmness was not a virtue. It was not admired, respected, nor encouraged in any capacity. Calmness, to the medieval mind, was one of the most suspicious states a human could enter. Life was supposed to be a hectic cyclone of fear, discomfort, hunger, disease, and the constant awareness that anything, truly anything, could kill you before supper. If you looked calm during all that, people did not think you were wise. They thought you were broken. Imagine a medieval village in peak daily chaos. Chickens are running through the streets like they're late for something. A goat is trying to eat someone's laundry. A baby is crying because it has been alive for 3 days and has already lost all hope. A blacksmith is yelling at his apprentice for existing too loudly. Smoke drifts from chimneys with the smell of yesterday's soup, which is also today's soup and tomorrow's soup. Life is a loud, muddy mess. Now imagine someone standing in the middle of it all, serene, silent, peaceful, breathing like a monk who's just invented meditation centuries too early. To modern eyes, that's self-regulation. To medieval eyes, that's possession. A calm person wasn't seen as someone with emotional control. They were seen as someone who'd been spiritually anesthetized. Medieval people believed that fear was the natural human state, the baseline emotion encoded into the soul. Anyone who didn't show fear was assumed to have lost their ability to recognize danger. Or worse, they were in league with the danger. If a person stayed calm while others panicked, villagers reacted as if they'd witnessed dark magic. A fire breaks out. Everyone screams, scrambles, throws water wildly in every direction, but the calm person just watches, unbothered. Immediately, 2 conclusions form. Either this person started the fire, or they've struck some sort of supernatural bargain to be above earthly concerns. Even in smaller crises, like bad weather, the appearance of a strange animal, or rumours of a wandering spirit, calmness was alarming. If you didn't join the collective panic, you were treated with suspicion. Medieval logic insisted that if everyone else was terrified, you should be too. Anything else meant your emotions came from an unnatural source. Priests especially distrusted calm people. They interpreted calmness as spiritual interference, something holding your fear hostage. In their view, only saints and the possessed remained calm in chaos. And saints were rare, very rare. So in medieval Europe, calmness wasn't enlightenment. It wasn't strength. It was a red flag, a warning, a sign that your soul was either too pure or too compromised for ordinary life. Either way, nobody trusted it. In the Viking Age, marriage wasn't the romantic candlelit saga people like to imagine today. There were no soft-focus proposals on fjord cliffs, no poetic speeches, and definitely no kneeling, unless someone dropped a sword and had to pick it up. Instead, Marriage functioned as a strategic alliance between families, and love was a pleasant optional bonus if it happened to appear sometime before death. What really mattered were the clans behind the bride and groom, their land, their cattle, and how much political leverage they could create together. A Viking marriage began long before the couple ever met, usually with two fathers negotiating like seasoned diplomats. They discussed boundaries, inheritance rights, conflict histories, and who once stole whose sheep 20 winters ago. Every detail was examined because in Norse society, marrying someone meant tying your entire family's fate to another clan. If the other side had a habit of feuding, raiding, or accidentally setting their longhouse on fire, you might think twice before offering your daughter. The most critical part of this negotiation was the munda, the bride price paid by the groom's family. This wasn't a purchase of the bride, even though it sounds suspiciously like one. It was actually compensation for the labour and skills the bride's family was losing. Viking women worked hard, farming, weaving, managing the household, so losing one meant losing serious value. The munda acknowledged her importance and signalled that the groom's family was stable and honourable enough to marry into. Once both families agreed on the terms, the marriage was set, and the couple's personal feelings were considered, theoretically. But even though families made the matches, Vikings didn't treat marriage like a prison sentence. A bride had to accept the marriage agreement. Sure, she had about as much negotiating power as someone trying to argue with a thunderstorm, but her voice still mattered. Refusing a dangerous or dishonourable match was within her rights, and sagas mention women doing exactly that, sometimes loudly, sometimes dramatically, and occasionally with an axe nearby. By the time the agreement was sealed, the marriage wasn't just about two people. It was a legally binding alliance. Families became allies, blood feuds could end, trade routes could open, and two clans who disliked each other yesterday might suddenly pretend to be best friends because now they were in-laws. That was Viking marriage, not a fairy tale, but a political contract written in honour, obligation, and the occasional passive-aggressive glance across the settlement. If Viking marriage was a contract, then the dowry and bride price were the financial signatures written in bold runes across the whole deal. These weren't symbolic gifts or polite gestures. They were cold, practical assets meant to protect the bride, safeguard her future, and ensure that neither family behaved like fools once the wedding ale ran out. First, let's talk about the fye, the dowry. This was the property the bride's family sent with her. Clothes, jewellery, livestock, loom weights, household keys, sometimes even land rights. But make no mistake, this wasn't a gift to the groom. This was her wealth, and she kept full legal claim over it. Imagine walking into marriage today with your own personal treasure chest that your husband couldn't touch without risking public humiliation and maybe a duel. That was the Viking dowry. Then there was the munda, the bride price, paid by the groom's family. To modern ears, it sounds suspiciously like buying a wife on discount. But in Viking culture, it worked differently. The munda proved the groom's family was serious, honourable, and financially stable enough to enter the alliance. If a man couldn't afford it, the marriage simply didn't happen. Viking women may not have chosen their husbands directly, but destiny tended to avoid pairing them with bankrupt fools. Now here's where it gets interesting. All of this property ultimately protected the woman, not the man. The dowry went with her into marriage, and the bride price became part of her security and her children's inheritance. If her husband acted dishonourably, say by cheating, failing to provide, or picking a fight with her family like an absolute amateur, she had leverage. Legal leverage, economic leverage, the kind of leverage that made even the boldest warrior consider his life choices. And Viking men knew this. A woman entering marriage carried her keys, literal iron keys, as a symbol that she controlled the household's stored wealth. She managed the food supply, the valuables, the weaving income, and the domestic authority. If her husband died or vanished on a poorly planned raid, which happened more often than families liked to admit, her dowry and bride price ensured she wasn't left destitute. So, while Viking society was undeniably patriarchal, marriage economics revealed a quiet truth. Viking women were far from powerless. Their wealth moved with them. Their rights were protected, and if their husbands ever stepped out of line, well, that's when things got even more entertaining. But we'll get to that. Before a Viking marriage contract became official, there was something resembling courtship, although calling it that might be generous. Vikings did not date the way modern people do. There were no long walks on the beach, no awkward dinners, no texting back after 3 days. Instead, there was a strange blend of family negotiation, subtle signals, public reputation, and the occasional heroic act that involved slaying something large and unpleasant. For most Viking couples, the match was arranged between families, but that doesn't mean attraction or personal preference didn't exist. It just operated quietly, like a nervous squirrel. A young man might show interest by helping a woman's father with work, or by boasting of his strength and skills during gatherings. A young woman, in turn, might drop hints through behaviour, offering a man a drink first, sitting beside him at feasts, or demonstrating that she could run a household efficiently, because nothing says romance like showing off your butter-churning superiority. Still, arranged didn't mean forced. A woman could object to a match, and in saga literature they often did, sometimes calmly, sometimes explosively. If a suitor had a reputation for being violent, incompetent, dishonourable, or simply smelled like he hadn't bathed since the last blood moon, she could reject him. A wise family listened, because ignoring a strong-willed Viking woman was a great way to end up with an axe-related disagreement. Men also had to prove themselves. Wealth mattered, honour mattered, and so did connections. A man who lacked land or cattle wasn't seen as marriage material unless he had truly legendary skills. The kind of man who could return from a raid with enough silver to blind the sun. Viking masculinity wasn't just about muscles, it was about responsibility and the ability to protect a household. Interestingly, courtship could also involve gift-giving. Jewellery, carved bone pieces, or finely crafted tools were signs of affection. But here's the twist. Giving a woman a gift without her family's approval could imply a secret relationship, and that could trigger feuds. Viking dating, therefore, required not only charm, but strategic caution. One wrong gesture, and suddenly your romantic intentions might be interpreted as a political threat. But the most surprisingly tender part of Viking pre-marriage life came from conversations. Men and women did talk, privately, subtly, cleverly. They exchanged thoughts, tested compatibility, and built familiarity. It wasn't poetry, but it was honest. In a world built on honour and survival, emotional intelligence mattered, because once the clans shook hands and ale was poured, these two people were tied together for life, or at least until someone demanded a divorce. A Viking wedding was not a quiet, elegant affair with flower arches and neatly folded napkins. It was a full-scale community event that involved drinking, speeches, ritual objects, and enough symbolism to make a modern therapist nod with approval. Weddings lasted several days, depending on the wealth of the families, and they were so important that even people who disliked each other were expected to show up and pretend to be happy about it. The ceremony itself was deeply ritualistic. First came the separation of the bride and groom from their previous identities. The groom underwent a symbolic cleansing, often involving bathing, a detail worth noting, because Viking men were known for bathing more often than their medieval European neighbours. The bride went through her own transition, sometimes including the removal of her maiden's cranson, a delicate circlet worn by unmarried women. Her hair might be rebraided to signify maturity and the responsibilities she was about to take on. Think of it as the Viking version of getting ready, except with more symbolism and fewer hairstylists. Weapons played a central role, because of course they did. The groom typically carried a sword, sometimes a family heirloom passed down for generations. He presented this weapon to his bride, symbolizing that he entrusted her with the household's protection. She, in return, gave him gifts representing domestic authority, such as keys. While giving someone a sword today might lead to raised eyebrows or a phone call to security, in Viking culture, it was the height of romantic commitment. Then came the exchange of oaths, performed in front of witnesses. because Vikings took promises as seriously as they took feuds. The couple vowed loyalty and cooperation, and their families sealed the agreement with a feast. These oaths weren't poetic, but they were binding. In a society where reputation determined survival, breaking a marriage oath was the kind of disaster people gossiped about for decades. The feast that followed was where things truly came alive. Ale and mead flowed like rivers. Songs were sung, stories were told, and the skalds, Viking poets, performed verses celebrating the new alliance. If the food was good and the guests behaved, a wedding could become legendary. And finally, after the public rituals, came the private sealing of the marriage, the bedding ceremony. The families escorted the couple to their room, lit candles, placed symbolic gifts, and then left, ideally before things got awkward. Now the alliance wasn't just agreed on, it was confirmed. With the wedding complete, married life began. And that's where social expectations, household power, and gender roles got far more interesting. Once the wedding feasts were over and the mead barrels were empty, Viking married life began, and it was far more structured than people assume. Hollywood loves portraying Vikings as chaotic, axe-swinging maniacs who barely kept track of their boots, let alone their marriages. But in reality, Viking households operated like miniature kingdoms, and the person running that kingdom was usually the wife. Legally, the husband was the head of the family. Socially, he represented the household in public matters, politics, trade agreements, raids, and any situation involving shouting across long distances. But once he stepped through the door of the longhouse, the true centre of power often shifted. The wife held the keys, literal iron keys, which symbolised control over all domestic resources. The locked chests of valuables, food stores, textiles, tools, and trade goods were her domain. If a husband wanted access to something, he didn't simply take it. He asked. The Viking wife was expected to manage the farm, organise labour, distribute food, run weaving workshops, direct servants or thralls, and maintain household diplomacy. She was the longhouse economist, logistics officer, and sometimes the unofficial judge of who started what argument. If the husband died, travelled, or got lost on a raid, which happened with concerning frequency, she took over the entire estate. Viking law recognised her as a fully capable property manager, something many later medieval societies wouldn't even consider. Meanwhile, the husband's job wasn't just to swing a sword dramatically at passing boats. He handled external affairs, defending the farm, negotiating with neighbours, maintaining alliances, and providing for the household through farming, trading, or raiding. In a healthy marriage, the roles complemented each other. The wife managed the internal world, the husband managed the external one, and both roles were essential. Without one, the household collapsed faster than a badly built longhouse in a windstorm. Contrary to the stereotype, Viking couples often had cooperative, respectful partnerships. Sagas describe husbands discussing decisions with their wives, seeking advice, and even changing plans based on their counsel. A wise man listened to his wife, a foolish man ignored her and usually paid for it in reputation, wealth, or surprisingly creative domestic tension. Daily life wasn't glamorous. It was work, endless work, but it was shared work, and that created a partnership stronger than most modern people imagine. Vikings didn't idealize marriage, but they did value competence, loyalty, and mutual support. And when that loyalty was broken, well, Viking women had options, dramatic ones, and that's what comes next. When it came to fidelity, Viking society had expectations, and they weren't as one-sided as people tend to assume. Yes, husbands were expected to remain loyal, and no, cheating wasn't shrugged off with a boys will be boys attitude. In fact, a married man caught sneaking around risked humiliation, legal trouble, and, depending on the temperament of his wife, the possibility of being woken up with cold water, a missing beard braid, or the sharp edge of accountability. Affairs were taken seriously because they threatened the stability of clans. A child born out of wedlock could disrupt inheritances, spark feuds, or create social chaos. Viking laws made it clear adultery damaged reputations, and reputation was everything. A man accused of cheating could be challenged, fined, or publicly shamed. And if he kept breaking the rules, the consequences escalated, sometimes violently. But here's the twist that surprises most people. Viking women had even stricter protections. A woman caught cheating faced heavier penalties, yes, but she also had a built-in legal escape hatch, the right to divorce a man who wasn't meeting marital expectations. If a husband was neglecting her, failing to provide for her, or importing romantic distractions into the household, she could walk away. Legally, publicly, even proudly, and the sagas are full of examples. There's the tale of Gudrun Osvifusdottir, who confronted her husband over infidelity so boldly that historians still quote her lines like legendary mic drops. She later divorced him with full legal support. Then there's the famous case of a woman who not only divorced her cheating husband, but challenged him to a duel, a real one, because he slandered her honor afterward. Imagine your ex trying to insult you and your response is, "Meet me outside with weapons." Viking women did not play. Women were also protected from false accusations. Calling a woman unfaithful without proof was considered a grave insult, one severe enough to trigger blood feuds. If a man spread such rumors, he risked losing land, wealth, or teeth, depending on how her family felt that day. Even romantic rumors were handled with caution. Sitting too closely at a feast, exchanging gifts, or whispering too privately could start speculation, and speculation could start fights. So, Viking flirting wasn't just risky, it was practically a competitive sport. At the center of all this stood one idea. Honor mattered more than desire. Marriage was an alliance. Fidelity protected that alliance. And if anyone jeopardized it, well, Viking law offered solutions, and Viking women weren't shy about using them. If you think divorce is a modern invention, the Vikings would like a word with you, preferably shouted across a longhouse with 20 witnesses present. Norse society actually had clear, structured rules for ending a marriage, and women held more power in this process than in many later European cultures. A Viking woman could initiate divorce, execute it publicly, and walk away with her property and dignity intact, sometimes more intact than her husband's pride. The most common way for a woman to request divorce was surprisingly practical. She simply declared it, not privately. Oh no. Vikings didn't do things quietly. To make it official, a woman had to speak her decision in front of witnesses at key locations in the household, often at the front and rear doors. This was the Norse equivalent of posting a breakup announcement on every social platform in one day. And she didn't need dramatic reasons. Viking law allowed divorce for multiple causes, including abuse or violence, which was taken seriously, failure to provide. If a husband couldn't supply clothing or food, he wasn't fulfilling his end of the contract. Infidelity, which counted as breaking the marriage oath. Insulting her family, a surprisingly common cause in the sagas. Lack of interest in the marriage bed, politely described in legal texts with admirable vagueness. Women could also divorce widowed men who proved too incompatible, too old, or too fond of starting unnecessary feuds. The law didn't force a woman to stay trapped in a politically inconvenient marriage. Her clan's honor mattered more. Once divorced, the woman reclaimed her dowry, her personal wealth, and any property agreed upon in the marriage contract. If she brought land into the marriage, she kept it. If she managed the household well and increased the farm's value, she gained credit for that too. The husband wasn't stripped of everything, but he definitely felt the social sting. A divorced man had to work hard to repair his reputation and find another family willing to marry into his track record. Some sagas even describe women divorcing men on the spot, in the middle of an argument during feasts, or after discovering something they didn't like, such as a secret lover, a broken oath, or a husband behaving like a helpless child instead of a responsible adult. And yes, There are those legendary cases where a woman challenged her former husband to a duel over slander. Divorce court. Viking edition. What made all this possible was simple. Viking marriage was a contract, and contracts could end. Women weren't property, they were partners. And if a husband proved unworthy, Viking law didn't just allow her to leave, it practically held the door open. If divorce gave Viking women surprising power, widowhood took that power and handed them the entire longhouse with a bow on top. In Norse society, a widow wasn't expected to fade quietly into the background or rely on the charity of relatives. Instead, she stepped into a position of serious authority, often becoming the full, uncontested ruler of her household. Some Viking men probably rolled over in their graves seeing their wives run the farm better than they ever did, but that was simply the natural order of things. When a husband died, whether peacefully in bed or dramatically on a raid involving too much confidence and too little planning, the widow inherited control of the estate, not some of it, not a symbolic corner of it, all of it, until any children came of age. She managed land, livestock, servants, thralls, debts, income, and trade relations. She made decisions about the farm's future, approved marriages for her children, and handled disputes. If a neighbour tried to take advantage of her grief, they often discovered that Viking widows grieved quickly and negotiated aggressively. The sagas are full of widows who became political powerhouses. Some controlled significant wealth, some managed fleets, some arranged marriages that shaped the destiny of entire clans, and others, in true Viking fashion, remarried swiftly, not because they were desperate, but because remarriage served strategic purposes. A widow could bring her late husband's estate into a new alliance, strengthening her family's position. And here's the twist. Widows had full freedom to choose their next husband. Families still advised and negotiated, of course, but a widow's opinion suddenly mattered a great deal more than it did the first time around. After all, she was older, wealthier, and far more experienced in the political game of survival. A man courting a widow had to impress her, respect her, and not embarrass himself. The power dynamic was entirely different, and sometimes men competed fiercely for a widow's hand, especially if her land was fertile or her cattle plentiful. But widowhood wasn't just about power and remarriage. It also came with social respect. People recognized the emotional weight of losing a spouse, especially in a world where life was short and dangerous. A widow who protected her children, maintained her land, and upheld her husband's honour was admired, and sometimes feared, for her strength. In many ways, widowhood offered Viking women a rare thing: autonomy. They were no longer daughters or wives. They were heads of households. They could choose peace, marriage, independence, or ambition, and the law supported them. And with all this authority came another question. How were children raised in this world of alliances, honour, and strategic marriages? That's where we head next. In Viking society, children weren't raised simply to survive long winters, dodge the occasional stray axe, and grow impressive braids, although those skills were definitely useful. They were raised with one major purpose in mind: to continue the family line and strengthen alliances through future marriages. From the moment a child took their first breath inside a smoky longhouse, their life was interwoven with clan strategies, inheritance plans, and the never-ending chess match of kinship politics. Boys and girls alike grew up surrounded by the rhythms of farm life, the tales of old heroes, and the clear expectations of who they were meant to become. Viking parents did not sugarcoat reality. They didn't hide difficult topics behind "when you're older" speeches. They told their children exactly how honour worked, how alliances were made, and why insulting the wrong person could lead to very unfortunate consequences involving swords. Children learned early that reputation was currency. Girls were taught household management, textile production, healing skills, and the subtle art of social diplomacy. Essential tools for future wives who might one day hold the keys to an entire estate. A girl who could organise a feast, settle an argument, and manage winter stores without accidentally starving. The sheep was considered highly marriageable. Mothers absolutely passed down their knowledge. Daughters learned by watching, listening, and doing. Boys, meanwhile, were prepared for their own roles, learning farming, trading, combat, and public negotiation. But despite what modern stereotypes imagine, Viking fathers didn't raise miniature raiders who did nothing but swing axes and shout. Boys were trained to be responsible landowners, trustworthy partners, and dependable allies. A young man who picked fights or acted foolishly threatened the whole family's reputation. Not a great way to attract future in-laws. When it came to inheritance, Viking law was surprisingly balanced. Sons received shares of land and wealth, but daughters also inherited property and movable goods. A daughter's inheritance often formed part of her dowry, ensuring she entered marriage with real power. If both parents died, the family council, usually uncles, aunts, or grandparents, stepped in, but the estate remained tied to the children. Preparing children for marriage wasn't about romance, it was about legacy. Parents sought matches that would strengthen trade routes, settle feuds, or expand influence. But children weren't voiceless pieces in the game. Their preferences mattered, not always enough to override politics, but enough to shape negotiations. And so, Viking society kept turning. Children grew, families planned, alliances formed, and marriages tied clan networks into vast webs of obligation and opportunity. Through it all, love sometimes blossomed, sometimes didn't, but the legacy endured. The Medici court was a masterpiece, a glittering stage set where every fresco, every velvet curtain, every polished marble floor was part of a carefully curated illusion. Florence adored beauty, and the Medici understood beauty better than anyone. They weaponized it. Behind those radiant Renaissance surfaces, the court wasn't a peaceful haven of philosophers and painters sipping wine while discussing Plato. No, it was a pressure cooker of ambition, seduction, and political maneuvering disguised as polite conversation. Anyone entering Palazzo Medici, or later Palazzo Vecchio, could feel it immediately. The tension woven into the tapestries. Courtiers bowed deeply, smiled warmly, and lied effortlessly. A compliment could be sincere, or it could be the first step in a trap. A friendly invitation to supper might lead to a new alliance, or a new scandal. Every gesture carried weight. Every whisper mattered. Even the servants learned quickly that silence was a currency. At the centre of this glittering world stood the Medici themselves. Powerful bankers turned de facto rulers, a family rich enough to buy loyalty and dangerous enough to demand it. Cosimo the Elder, Lorenzo the Magnificent, Catherine de' Medici. Each generation shaped the court in its own image. Lorenzo filled it with poets, philosophers, and musicians. Catherine filled it with spies, ladies-in-waiting, and a healthy dose of paranoia. Different styles, same core strategy. Control the narrative, control the court. But for all its magnificence, the Medici household was less a home and more a political theatre. Every room had a double purpose. Reception halls hosted diplomatic gatherings by day and quiet conspiracies by night. Private chambers witnessed tender romances, bitter arguments, and secret affairs that could shift the balance of power. Even the gardens, lush, fragrant, peaceful, served as meeting grounds for whispered promises and forbidden rendezvous. Elegance was expected, restraint was required, but beneath the silks, brocades, and carefully crafted smiles lived human desires: jealousy, longing, fear, ambition. And in the Medici court, those desires had consequences. A careless flirtation could spark a feud. A hidden affair could destroy a marriage, a fortune, or a family's standing. Yet these same scandals could also elevate the clever, the ones who navigated passion and politics with equal finesse. The Medici court was a jewel of Renaissance Italy, glittering, beautiful, sophisticated. But like every jewel, it had sharp edges, and many who reached for it found themselves bleeding. Life as a courtier in the Medici world looked glamorous from the outside. silk robes, glittering banquets, poetry recitals, private masques, and strolls through perfumed gardens made everything appear luxurious. But beneath the elegance lay a brutal truth. The Medici court was a battlefield, and every courtier was both soldier and target. Social survival required more than charm. It demanded strategy, self-control, and a smile sharp enough to cut marble. To thrive in this world, a courtier had to master the art of calculated behaviour. Silence was sometimes safer than speaking. Speaking was sometimes safer than silence. One wrong phrase uttered during a feast could ruin a reputation faster than spilled wine on silk. Courtiers learned to read faces as carefully as scholars read manuscripts. A slight shift in a noblewoman's posture, a pause before a duke's laugh. These tiny details determined alliances, and status at court wasn't static. It shifted like Florence's unpredictable weather. One moment you were dining beside a Medici cousin. The next, you were mysteriously uninvited from gatherings because you supported the wrong marriage, offended the wrong poet, or, heaven forbid, wore the wrong colour on the wrong day. Fashion, believe it or not, was political. If the Duchess favoured emerald green this season, wearing ruby red wasn't a bold personal choice. It was a declaration of war. Many courtiers arrived in Florence hoping for advancement, a marriage, a position, a patron, or a generous pension. But the Medici didn't reward ambition lightly. Every opportunity came with strings, and those strings were usually tangled. A flattering remark to a Medici prince could gain you a favour, or attract the jealousy of a rival who had been flattering him 5 minutes before you arrived. Even intellectuals and artists navigating the court's cultural circles weren't immune. A misplaced joke about the wrong classical figure could earn a scolding that lasted a lifetime. And then there were the spies. Oh yes, Florence was full of them. Ladies-in-waiting, scribes, stable boys, musicians, perfumers. Many were paid quietly to observe, report, and influence. Catherine de' Medici perfected this system when she later moved to France, but she learned the technique in Florence, where secrets were the most valuable currency after gold. Yet, despite the danger, courtiers stayed. Because at the Medici court, scandal wasn't just a threat. It was an opportunity. A cleverly timed rumour, a carefully staged coincidence, a whispered confession in the perfect ear. And suddenly, fortunes changed overnight. Behind velvet curtains and frescoed walls, survival was performance. And the best performers rose highest. Flirtation in the Medici court wasn't innocent. It wasn't even private. It was a performance played on a stage where every spectator pretended not to see anything, while taking notes for later. In a world ruled by alliances and reputation, desire was both intoxicating and lethal. Courtiers tiptoed along a razor's edge, where a single glance could be interpreted as devotion, insult, or strategy. The Renaissance loved the idea of courtly love, poetry, longing, beautiful metaphors about burning hearts and aching souls. But in Florence, this romantic ideal lived side by side with real politique. A nobleman might recite a sonnet to a married woman not because he adored her, but because winning her favour could grant him access to her husband's political circle. A lady might smile a little too long at a visiting diplomat, not because she felt sparks, but because flirting kept foreign alliances warm. Love was rarely aimless in the Medici world. Every compliment had a purpose. Every gesture carried a message. But even calculated games could ignite genuine passion. Confessions took place in secret corners of gardens, in dim hallway alcoves, in private loggias overlooking Florence's rooftops. Lovers exchanged tokens, a ribbon, a glove, a clipping of hair, each one a silent promise that had to be hidden from the wrong eyes. And there were many wrong eyes. Ladies-in-waiting reported everything. Tutors and scribes listened behind partially closed doors. Even the frescoes seemed to stare, silently judging every encounter. The risk made the passion sharper. A married woman caught in an affair could be exiled, humiliated, or sent to a convent. A man exposed in scandal might lose his position, his income, or his political backing. Yet scandal still bloomed like roses in the Medici gardens, beautiful, fragrant, and full of thorns. Some affairs became legendary. Lorenzo de' Medici himself adored poetry, beauty, and subtle flirtation. His court attracted women and men whose charms were famous across Italy. More dangerous were the affairs that connected rival factions. A romance between families aligned with opposite political camps could destabilize Florence faster than a failed bank loan. In extreme cases, passion became a catalyst for assassinations, as the Medici learned all too well during the Pazzi conspiracy. But for every tragic love story, there were also quiet, tender connections that never made the chronicles. Relationships that survived the intrigue. Couples who managed to hide their feelings well enough to avoid destruction. Still, in a world where frescoes glowed and chandeliers sparkled, the most brilliant light, passion, always cast the darkest shadows. Marriage in the Medici court was rarely about love. It was about dynasties, silk-bound alliances, and the delicate balance between ambition and appearances. A noble wedding in Florence looked like a fairy tale. Velvet gowns, glittering jewels, banquet tables groaning under roasted pheasants and sculpted marzipan. But beneath all that beauty lay an arrangement as carefully negotiated as a trade treaty. Families examined potential spouses the way bankers evaluated investments. An advantageous marriage could elevate an entire lineage, secure political influence, or save a family from financial ruin. The Medici, being bankers first and rulers second, understood this better than anyone. They arranged marriages with the precision of accountants balancing ledgers. A bride brought dowries of land, art, and prestige. A groom offered connections, military backing, or entry into powerful social networks. If affection developed later, it was considered a charming extra. If it didn't, well, that's what separate bedchambers were for. Inside these arranged unions, harmony was expected, or at least performed. Couples learned to play their parts in public. Polite smiles, coordinated gestures, and the illusion of fondness. A wife might walk gracefully beside her husband, whispering witty lines as if they were deeply connected. A husband might offer his arm during ceremonies, as though the relationship were built on genuine trust. But the reality was often much colder. Many spouses lived parallel lives, intersecting only when politics demanded it. The expectations placed on noblewomen were immense. A Medici bride was expected to be the perfect combination of elegance, modesty, diplomacy, and fertility. She was the symbol of her family's honour, and Florence watched her every move. A single misstep could ignite gossip, and gossip in Florence travelled faster than the Arno in flood season. But even within these constraints, women wielded quiet power. A clever wife could influence her husband's alliances, shape court opinion, and protect her children's futures with a single whispered suggestion. Men weren't free from scrutiny either. A husband's reputation depended on his ability to maintain stability. If he humiliated his wife publicly, neglected her, or allowed scandal to enter their household, the court judged him just as harshly. After all, a man who could not manage his own household was unlikely to manage political crises. Marriage in the Medici world was a partnership. Sometimes cold, sometimes warm, occasionally brilliant, but always strategic. And when the illusion cracked, the consequences rippled through Florence like shock waves. Because in this court, a broken marriage didn't just break hearts, it broke alliances. And that was far more dangerous. In the Medici court, infidelity wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a political event. A whispered rumour of a mistress, a secret lover, or a forbidden liaison could ripple through Florence with the force of an earthquake. Affairs weren't merely romantic diversions, they were strategic hazards, weapons, opportunities, or catastrophes waiting to unfold. And in this world of silks and secrets, everyone pretended to be shocked by scandal while quietly enjoying every decadent detail. Let's start with the men. Noblemen in Renaissance Italy were expected to maintain mistresses, as long as they did so discreetly and respectfully. A well-placed mistress could soften political rivalries, charm allies, or even stabilize a man's reputation, provided she understood her role and stayed within the invisible boundaries of court etiquette. But if she grew too bold, if she sought influence beyond her station, or if she dared to insult a noble wife, the situation turned explosive. Affairs could lead to duels, feuds, and broken alliances. The wrong mistress could ruin an entire family. Women, on the other hand, were held to stricter standards. A noblewoman's affair, if discovered, could lead to exile, annulment, or confinement in a convent. But the danger didn't stop many of them. Why? Because love and loneliness made powerful motivations, especially when their arranged marriages felt like polite prisons. Behind heavy curtains and locked bedchambers, women formed emotional bonds, exchanged letters, and risked everything for moments of passion or understanding they couldn't find at home. Some of these affairs became legendary. Consider Giuliano de' Medici's romance with Simonetta Vespucci, Florence's greatest beauty and muse of Botticelli. Their chemistry became immortalized in art, whispered in poetry, and watched by an entire city that adored them. Whether they were physically involved remains uncertain, but in the gossip-driven world of Florence, perception mattered more than truth. Others were far more dangerous. A noblewoman entangled with a rival family's son could accidentally trigger political chaos. A courtier caught seducing a Medici relation might end up disappearing quietly, swept aside like dust beneath a velvet rug. And then there were affairs born from ambition, calculated seductions used to obtain secrets, influence decisions, or manipulate powerful men. These were the deadliest of all, because they blurred the line between romance and espionage. Yet irony ruled the Medici court. The same society that condemned infidelity also delighted in it. Affairs sold stories. Stories created leverage. Leverage determined survival. And in Florence, survival was the true currency of love. In the Medici court, scandal wasn't an accident. It was an instrument. A blade sharpened by whispers, carried through corridors and delivered with a smile. Florence thrived on gossip. The city was small enough that secrets travelled quickly, and powerful enough that those same secrets could ruin a life before the church bells finished ringing. Inside Medici palaces, a single rumour could topple a favourite, wound a marriage, or tilt the balance of political power. And everyone knew it. Rumours often began innocently enough. A servant noticed a nobleman slipping into a lady's chambers after dusk. A musician saw two lovers exchanging glances during a banquet. A diplomat overheard a hushed argument behind a tapestry. Within hours, the story evolved into something grander, darker, and far more entertaining. By the next morning, Florence could debate the scandal as if it were a public spectacle. And in a way, it was. The Medici court was a theatre, and scandal supplied the scripts. Political rivals weaponized gossip with surgical precision. If a noblewoman was rising too fast in influence, someone might suddenly discover that she had a secret admirer. If a courtier got too close to a Medici prince, whispers about financial misdeeds might magically appear. Scandal wasn't about truth, it was about utility. The more damaging the rumour, the more valuable it became. Yet some scandals exploded beyond anyone's control. Take, for instance, the Pazzi conspiracy. Though driven by politics rather than passion, it was fueled by whispered accusations, calculated betrayals, and quiet meetings behind frescoed walls. Every participant believed they were playing a subtle game, until daggers flashed inside the cathedral. Florence learned that rumours, once unleashed, could trigger anything from romantic embarrassment to outright assassination. Other scandals were softer, but no less destructive. The story of a Medici heir captivated by a married noblewoman could spark feuds between families. A rumoured affair between a lady-in-waiting and a foreign ambassador could compromise diplomatic negotiations. Even misinterpreted friendships became dangerous. Two people laughing too closely at a feast? Suspicious? A note passed between cousins? Potential treason? An extra smile? Practically an international incident. The tragic part was that many of these stories were exaggerated, or entirely false. But in a court obsessed with reputation, the mere possibility of scandal was enough to destroy someone's standing. A nobleman could lose patronage. A lady could lose her dowry prospects. A servant could lose their life. In the Medici court, truth was optional. But scandal was inevitable and unforgettable. Forget modern intelligence agencies. The Medici perfected espionage centuries before anyone invented a secret police badge. In their world, information was as valuable as gold, and far easier to weaponize. Behind the brocade curtains and polished marble floors, Florence pulsed with a network of watchers, whisperers, letter readers, and informants who turned everyday life into a masterclass in surveillance. Everyone spied. Everyone was spied upon. And everyone pretended this was completely normal. Ladies-in-waiting were the unofficial intelligence officers of the palazzo. These women accompanied noble ladies through every hour of the day, dressing them, attending them, entertaining them, and quietly reporting everything they saw to the right patron. A sigh too heavy, a blush too sudden, a furtive glance at the wrong man. Nothing escaped their attention. They were the velvet-wrapped eyes and ears of the court, gathering secrets while pretending to arrange jewellery. Servants, meanwhile, had access to the most compromising locations: bedchambers, powder rooms, private gardens. A whisper overheard while refilling a wine cup could reshape political alliances by sunset. Stable boys overheard emotional arguments between lovers slipping in and out of shadows. Cooks intercepted smuggled love notes tucked between loaves of bread. Even perfumers noticed when someone ordered a fragrance meant to disguise the scent of a secret rendezvous. The Medici themselves encouraged this system. They relied on webs of informants to detect plots and prevent uprisings. Cosimo the Elder was known for his diplomatic listening, while Lorenzo the Magnificent kept correspondences so detailed that modern historians still marvel at his network. But Catherine de' Medici, trained in Florence before ruling France, turned espionage into an art. She used coded letters, invisible ink made from lemon juice, and informants hidden in every royal corridor. Her early years in the Medici court taught her that love and betrayal often shared the same bed. Letters were the lifeblood of this clandestine world. Handwritten notes carried affection, threats, bargaining details, and heartfelt confessions, but they also carried tremendous risk. Rival factions bribed scribes to read them. Trusted messengers lost them intentionally. Some nobles even steamed open-sealed letters using heated metal spoons, Renaissance espionage at its finest. One badly phrased sentence could destroy a reputation. Privacy was a luxury no one truly possessed. Even locked doors offered only symbolic security. Someone always knew something. Someone always watched. Someone always listened. And in a world where secrets flowed like wine, the only real power belonged to the person who controlled the information, or the person who leaked it at exactly the right moment. In the Medici court, betrayal wasn't just a personal matter. It was a political catastrophe with a body count. Behind the luxurious velvet curtains and radiant frescoes, the stakes of love, loyalty, and disloyalty were brutally high. Courtiers didn't just risk heartbreak, they risked exile, imprisonment, or a suspiciously sudden illness that left doctors scratching their heads and priests preparing last rites. Florence had many remedies for scandal, but poison was the one whispered about most often. The Renaissance loved its toxins. Arsenic, belladonna, mercury, and even powdered gemstones made appearances in medical recipes, cosmetic powders, and, when needed, elegant revenge plots. A single dose could be slipped into wine goblets, sugared almonds, or even perfumed gloves. And although modern historians exaggerate the frequency, the fear of poison was very real. A lover scorned, a rival thwarted, or a spouse embarrassed in public might inspire suspicions that lasted for years. But poison wasn't the only tool of revenge. Public humiliation was an art form in Florence. A nobleman caught in a scandal might find satirical poems circulating through the city, mocking his manners, his morals, or, worst of all, his fashion sense. A woman wronged by a faithless husband could retaliate through alliances, whispering in the ears of influential friends until his political footing eroded. Even small, calculated acts, a snubbed invitation, a pointed remark at a feast, a strategically timed fainting spell, could send shockwaves through the court. Some betrayals became legendary. When a Medici heir took a mistress who insulted his wife, whispers turned into fury, and alliances shifted until the woman suddenly vanished from public view. Another time, an ambitious courtier entangled himself with two rival factions. When his duplicity came to light, he fled Florence entirely, leaving behind poetry, debts, and an unfortunate wife who had to explain everything to her family. Jealousy was a constant companion. Florence's beauty, its art, its culture, all were overshadowed by the insecure pride of men and women who feared losing what little power they possessed. A single misplaced flirtation could trigger vendettas, and vendettas in Italy tended to escalate quickly. A glare across a banquet table could lead to a duel at dawn. A privately spoken insult might become a public feud lasting generations. Yet, for all the danger, revenge wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was subtle. A cold smile, a forged letter, a convenient misunderstanding that toppled an enemy without spilling a drop of blood. In the Medici court, revenge wasn't just punishment. It was performance. And the audience? Florence watched every moment, hungry for more. For all its scandals, seductions, secrets, and simmering feuds, the Medici court wasn't just a place where reputations died. It was also a place where new identities were born. In Florence, survival meant reinvention. Anyone who lived long enough inside those frescoed walls learned that cunning mattered more than bloodline. Timing mattered more than truth, and adaptability mattered more than loyalty. If a scandal knocked you down, you didn't stay down. You pivoted, reinvented, found a new patron, or crafted a new narrative. Florence loved transformation just as much as it loved gossip. The people who thrived weren't the loudest or the bravest. They were the observant ones, those who knew when to speak, when to disappear, and when to reinvent their entire persona overnight. A lady disgraced by an affair might resurface months later as a pious patroness of the arts, commissioning religious altarpieces and donating to convents. A courtier tarnished by political missteps could reinvent himself as a scholar, hosting intellectual salons filled with poetry and philosophy instead of feasts and flirtations. Reinvention was Florence's favourite form of survival, and the Medici mastered it better than anyone. Even love, with all its dangers, had a way of reshaping lives. Some romances faded quietly, swallowed by duty and distance. Others endured, protected by loyal friends and hidden rooms. A few were immortalised in art, in Botticelli's graceful figures, in Michelangelo's sketches, in the poetry Lorenzo penned for his own circle of muses. Passion left traces everywhere, in sculptures, in frescoes, in letters folded so tightly they still carry the imprint of trembling hands. The Medici themselves understood the power of love and scandal better than any family in Europe. Their marriages forged alliances. Their affairs fueled gossip. Their romances inspired artists who turned private desires into public masterpieces. And their scandals shaped the political landscape of Florence, influencing everything from bank loans to papal elections. The Medici did not merely participate in the culture of love and intrigue. They defined it. But perhaps the most fascinating legacy of the Medici court is how deeply human it all was. Beneath the layers of velvet, gold, and political manoeuvring lived people driven by the same impulses that shape every era: longing, jealousy, ambition, fear, tenderness. Their world looked different, more gilded, more dangerous, but their hearts behaved the same as ours. And maybe that's why the Medici scandals continue to captivate us. They remind us that behind every painting, behind every palace wall, behind every carefully curated legend, there were human beings who loved recklessly, desired dangerously, and survived brilliantly. When Augustus stepped into power after decades of civil war, he inherited a Rome exhausted, paranoid, and divided. Senators whispered behind columns, generals watched him with concealed jealousy, and the memory of Julius Caesar's assassination hung over the forum like a ghost that refused to leave. Augustus understood the lesson perfectly. Rome could be controlled, admired, even adored, but it could never be trusted. If he wanted to rule, he needed something stronger than public support and political reforms. He needed protection. The idea of a personal bodyguard wasn't new. Roman generals often kept elite soldiers near them during campaigns, men chosen for their loyalty and skill. But Augustus did something unprecedented. He institutionalized this practice. He made it permanent. He made it Roman. And in doing so, he created an entirely new force, one that would eventually decide the fate of emperors themselves. He called them the Praetorian Guard, taking the name from the Praetorium, the headquarters tent that generals used during campaigns. But these soldiers were no ordinary legionaries. Augustus hand-selected them from Italy's best troops, choosing men whose families, reputations, and loyalties he could track closely. He paid them more than regular soldiers. He housed them closer to Rome. He dressed them in distinct uniforms and equipped them with the finest weapons. Every detail screamed, "These are not just protectors. These are elite." At first, the Praetorians blended into Rome quietly. Augustus, ever subtle, distributed them across nearby towns to avoid alarming the Senate. The last thing he wanted was another accusation of tyranny, so the guard protected him discreetly, guarding his home, escorting him in public, and keeping watch during ceremonies. To the average Roman, they seemed like an extension of order, a symbol of stability after years of chaos. But Augustus knew exactly what he was building. This wasn't just a shield. It was a political instrument. These men weren't just defending him. They were binding themselves to him. Their salaries, their privileges, and their future depended entirely on the emperor's survival. And in a world where shifting loyalties could topple a regime overnight, Augustus had created a force that would hold his power in place with iron discipline. Yet as the years passed, the guard grew stronger, richer, and more aware of their importance. Augustus had hoped to control them. Instead, he had planted a seed that would one day overshadow even the emperor. The Praetorian Guard was born to protect the throne, but soon they would become powerful enough to decide who sat on it. The Praetorian Guard wasn't just another unit in Rome's vast military machine. They were the elite of the elite. Soldiers so carefully selected, so generously paid, and so dangerously empowered that they existed in a category entirely their own. To become a Praetorian meant walking into a world where discipline met privilege, and where loyalty to the emperor wasn't just expected, it was purchased, cultivated, and monitored. First, there was the recruitment. Ordinary legionaries came from across the empire, from Spain to Syria. But Augustus restricted Praetorian membership to Italians only, men whose families and backgrounds could be traced with precision. These were soldiers with reputations, roots, and identities Rome could verify. They weren't anonymous recruits from distant provinces. They were men whose loyalty could be audited. Their training was rigorous. Praetorians drilled like any legionary: shield formations, javelin throws, sword combat, unarmed grappling, but with an added emphasis on speed and precision. They weren't expected to fight mass battles in vast open fields. They were trained for urban combat, palace defense, escort formations, and high-risk close-quarters engagements. A legionary fought nations. A Praetorian fought assassins. In return for this service, their rewards were lavish. They earned triple the salary of a normal soldier. They served shorter terms. They enjoyed Roman citizenship benefits, legal privileges, and special exemptions. And most importantly, they lived close to power. While ordinary legions patrolled distant frontiers, freezing along the Rhine or sweating in Syria, the Praetorians stayed near Rome, enjoying better housing, better food, and better influence. This closeness mattered. A legionary might dream of seeing the emperor once in his life. A Praetorian guarded his door, stood beside his throne, and overheard conversations that could topple governments. They saw the emperor at his strongest, at his weakest, and at his most vulnerable. They saw the machinery of the empire from the inside, and they never forgot it. With privilege came arrogance. Praetorians began to see themselves not merely as protectors, but as a brotherhood with a role greater than the legions. They were the emperor's shield, but also his shadow, a shadow that watched, judged, and learned. Over time, they became more than soldiers. They became kingmakers in training. For now, though, under Augustus, they were still disciplined, still focused, still held firmly in check. But the seeds of danger were there, hidden beneath polished armour and perfect formation drills. Because when soldiers stand this close to power, eventually they start to wonder why they don't hold it themselves. For the first few decades of their existence, the Praetorian Guard lived quietly on the outskirts of Rome, scattered across nearby towns so the Senate wouldn't panic at the sight of elite troops lingering too close to political power. Augustus understood appearances. He understood that nothing frightened senators more than armed men with opinions. So he hid the Praetorians in plain sight, nearby but never too visible. That delicate balance shattered under his successor, Tiberius. Tiberius was a capable general but a reluctant emperor, uneasy in crowds and uninterested in the political theatre Rome demanded. Into this vacuum stepped one man, Lucius Aelius Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. Ambitious, calculating, patient, Sejanus saw what no one before him had dared imagine. The Praetorian Guard could be more than an imperial shield. It could be an imperial lever. Sejanus persuaded Tiberius to do something no emperor had done before. Move all 9 Praetorian cohorts into a single fortified camp inside Rome, the Castra Praetoria, a fortress within the capital, a permanent reminder of who held the real muscle in the empire. From that moment, everything changed. The Praetorians were no longer distant protectors. They were everywhere, guarding temples, patrolling the streets, attending Senate meetings, shadowing officials. Rome woke up each morning under the gaze of thousands of elite soldiers who answered to one man. And that man wasn't the emperor. It was Sejanus. With their new headquarters, the Guard became a political force. Senators could no longer plot freely. A whisper might reach Sejanus's ears. Rivals could no longer rely on distance. Praetorians could march across the city in minutes. Even Tiberius, the emperor himself, began to feel trapped by the very soldiers sworn to protect him. Meanwhile, the Praetorians enjoyed unprecedented influence. They watched as Roman elites came begging for favour, alliances, and protection. They accepted bribes, forged loyalties, and quietly punished those who underestimated them. A nod from a Praetorian commander could ruin or elevate a career. Rome's political system, already fragile, tilted. And the Praetorians learned a dangerous truth. Once you become essential, you become powerful. Once you become powerful, you become feared. Once you become feared, emperors start to look less like masters and more like opportunities. The Guard had entered Rome as protectors. They would remain as power brokers, and soon something even more dangerous. Once the Praetorian Guard established itself inside Rome, the city changed. People walked a little faster, talked a little quieter, and looked over their shoulders just a little more often. Everyone knew that the Praetorians weren't merely soldiers anymore. They were watchers, judges, enforcers. And increasingly, they were the invisible hand behind imperial decisions. Rome had gained a second senate, one made of steel instead of marble. It didn't take long for their political role to grow teeth. The Guard's first major test of influence came under Tiberius. Sejanus, their commander, used the Guard to eliminate political rivals, intimidate senators, and even execute members of the imperial family under the pretense of protecting the emperor. The irony was delicious. The bodyguard force created to prevent imperial assassinations became the tool used to carry out political executions. The Praetorians learned something intoxicating. Their swords could shape the empire more efficiently than Senate debates ever could. But the moment that truly revealed their new power came in the year 31, when Sejanus overreached. He attempted a quiet coup, imagining himself the next emperor. Tiberius, watching from distant Capri, struck back. With a single order, he turned the guard against their own commander. They marched into the Senate, arrested Sejanus, and executed him the same day. The message was clear. The Praetorians could make or break anyone, even their own leader, and it didn't stop there. Under Caligula, the guard protected an increasingly unstable emperor, whose unpredictable whims made Rome feel like a stage for some divine joke. When Caligula's madness became intolerable, it was the Praetorians who acted. In 41, a group of officers assassinated him in a palace corridor. It was the first time the guard killed an emperor, but it would certainly not be the last. Then came the truly astonishing moment. They chose the next emperor themselves. In the chaos following Caligula's death, Praetorian soldiers found Claudius hiding behind a curtain. Instead of arresting him, they proclaimed him emperor. Not with Senate approval, not through inheritance, but through military authority alone. The Senate had no choice but to accept their decision. The Praetorians had proven that emperors didn't rule Rome. They did. Their influence was no longer subtle. It was absolute. The guard had tasted power, and power tasted better than loyalty. From this point forward, emperors didn't just worry about assassins. They worried about their own bodyguards. By the 2nd century, the Praetorian Guard had crossed a line that Augustus never intended them to approach, let alone step over. They were no longer simply the emperor's bodyguards. They were no longer merely kingmakers. They had become something far more terrifying, king-sellers. And the moment that revealed just how unrestrained their ambition had become arrived in the year 193, during one of the most disgraceful episodes in Roman history. It began with the murder of Emperor Pertinax. Pertinax was a disciplined, well-intentioned ruler who made one fatal mistake. He tried to impose order on the Praetorian Guard. He attempted to reform them, reduce their corruption, and curb their privileges. This was noble, it was rational, and it was suicidal. Within 3 months of taking power, the Praetorians stormed the palace, cut him down, and left his head on a pole as a warning to anyone foolish enough to challenge their authority. Then they did something no one thought possible. Something so outrageous that even Rome, a city accustomed to madness, felt a chill. They decided to auction off the throne. Inside the Castra Praetoria, the guard announced that the imperial title would go to the highest bidder. Not the most qualified general, not the rightful heir, not the most capable statesman, but the man with the biggest wallet. Rome's greatest empire, built on conquest and statesmanship, was reduced to a public sale. 2 contenders stepped forward: Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, Pertinax's father-in-law, and Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator known more for luxury than leadership. The bidding began. Like traders in a market, the Praetorians listened as the men shouted promises of donatives, massive cash payouts that would be handed directly to the guard once they crowned the new emperor. Julianus outbid Sulpicianus with an astronomical offer: 25,000 sesterces per soldier, a mind-blowing fortune for every Praetorian. And so, in a grotesque parody of ceremony, the guard declared Julianus emperor. They escorted him to the Senate, forcing the humiliated senators to ratify the decision. Outside, the people of Rome howled with anger. They hurled stones and insults. They cursed the Praetorians by name. Julianus reigned for just 66 days. The army legions, furious, disgusted, and ashamed of the guard's corruption, marched on Rome. When they arrived, the Praetorians did not even fight. They surrendered Julianus, who was executed in the palace he bought. The legions then punished the guard, stripping them of their power, temporarily. The message was clear. The Praetorian Guard had crossed every line. They had sold the empire, and Rome would never forget it. After the Guard crowned Claudius in 41, Rome learned an uncomfortable truth. Emperors no longer rose solely through bloodlines or Senate decrees. They rose through Praetorian approval. The Guard had become the empire's backstage puppeteers, and every emperor that followed had to reckon with their growing appetite for influence, wealth, and fear. Claudius understood immediately how delicate his situation was. He hadn't fought for his throne, he hadn't inherited it, and he certainly hadn't earned it by popular acclaim. The Praetorians found him cowering behind a curtain and dragged him into power. That meant his first priority wasn't governing Rome, it was paying the bill. Claudius showered the Praetorians with gifts, bonuses, and privileges, ensuring their loyalty the way one might tame a group of lions, by feeding them constantly and never turning your back. The Guard, satisfied for the moment, protected Claudius from conspirators, senators, and his own chaotic household. But they also learned an important lesson. If they could make an emperor, they could unmake one. Then came Nero. Nero's rise to power relied heavily on Praetorian cooperation. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, understood the Guard's influence far better than most. She bribed them, charmed their commanders, and ensured they were firmly on her son's side. Nero entered the purple with Praetorian cheers echoing through the palace halls, but the relationship soon soured. Nero's paranoia grew as his rule spiraled into excess. Senators plotted, generals whispered, even his own mother turned into a threat. To solve these problems, Nero relied again on the Praetorians, specifically their prefect, Sextus Afranius Burrus, a man who held Nero's fate in the palm of his armoured hand. Burrus, an experienced and steady commander, restrained the young emperor's worst impulses. As long as Burrus lived, Nero's madness had limits. But once Burrus died, those limits vanished. Suddenly the Guard splintered. Some supported Nero, others quietly shifted allegiance to Galba, a general in Spain who smelled opportunity. When Nero ordered the Praetorians to crack down on dissent, they hesitated. When Galba promised them enormous rewards for switching sides, they listened. And when Nero fled Rome in fear, hoping loyal troops would rally behind him, the Praetorians declared him a public enemy. Nero died abandoned, and Galba marched into Rome under Praetorian escort. The message was unmistakable. The Guard's loyalty wasn't earned. It was rented, and always up for renegotiation. Rome's emperors weren't ruling an empire. They were dancing on a blade held in Praetorian hands. When Nero died in 68, Rome didn't breathe a sigh of relief. It held its breath. The emperor was gone, and for the first time in over a century, the question of succession had no clear answer. Into this vacuum stepped the Praetorian Guard, now fully aware that the throne was theirs to give or take. What followed became one of the most chaotic periods in Roman history, the Year of the Four Emperors, a brutal carousel of ambition, betrayal, and military opportunism. It began with Galba. Galba marched on Rome with Praetorian support, but that support was already fragile. He refused to pay the lavish donatives he had promised them. He lectured the Guard on discipline. He tried to treat them like ordinary soldiers. This was, politically speaking, the equivalent of poking a nest of hungry wolves with a short stick. Within months, resentment simmered among the Praetorians. Enter Otho, charming, wealthy, and far more pragmatic. He bribed the Guard directly, promising the fortune Galba denied them. The Praetorians didn't hesitate. In a coordinated strike, they surrounded Galba in the Forum, cut him down, murdered his supporters, and carried Otho through the streets as their newly chosen emperor. The Senate, terrified and exhausted, accepted the fait accompli. But Otho's reign was doomed before it began. Far away, in the German legions, another contender rose. Vitellius, a general proclaimed emperor by soldiers who despised the Praetorians. To them, the Guard was a corrupt, overfed city force with too much influence. And so, two armies marched toward Rome. one defending Otho's Praetorian-backed claim, the other determined to destroy the guard's stranglehold. The battles were devastating. Otho lost. He took his own life to spare Rome further bloodshed, leaving Vitellius to enter the city triumphantly. For a moment, it seemed the Praetorians had met their match. Vitellius disbanded them, executed many officers, and attempted to erase their power. But power that deep doesn't disappear. It waits. In the east, yet another challenge arose. Vespasian, commander of the legions in Judea. His troops marched on Rome. Vitellius's forces collapsed. As chaos engulfed the capital, surviving Praetorians switched sides once again, throwing their support behind Vespasian, not out of loyalty, but because Vespasian's victory was inevitable. When the fighting ended, Rome had lost thousands of lives. Entire districts burned. 3 emperors died in a single year, and the Praetorian Guard, though battered, had proven one thing unmistakably. They were no longer guardians. They were political predators, and the empire itself had become their hunting ground. After the chaos of the Year of the 4 Emperors, the Praetorian Guard learned an important lesson. Survival meant adaptation. And adapt they did. Under the Flavian emperors, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, the Guard regained its strength, rebuilt its prestige, and perfected the art of influencing politics from the shadows rather than the streets. For a few decades, the empire enjoyed stability, but stability in Rome always contained a crack, and the Praetorians learned to pry those cracks wider. Under Domitian, the Guard became the emperor's personal weapon. Loyalty was rewarded lavishly. Disobedience was crushed instantly. Domitian trusted the Praetorians more than the Senate, more than the generals, more than anyone except himself. This blind trust proved catastrophic. When conspirators plotted his assassination in 96, the Guard's prefect, Titus Flavius Norbanus, conveniently disappeared from the scene. Whether he looked away or subtly assisted is still debated, but the silence of the Guard spoke volumes. Then came the Nerva-Trajan transition, a turning point in Praetorian brutality. When Nerva became emperor after Domitian's death, the Praetorians were furious. They liked Domitian. He had paid them well. He had trusted them. Nerva, an elderly statesman, had not earned their loyalty. In a stunning act of intimidation, the Praetorians stormed the palace, seized conspirators Nerva had promised to spare, and executed them publicly. They forced the trembling emperor to watch, making it clear the Guard's loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be purchased. The Guard reached new heights under Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, emperors who understood the value of keeping them content. They built them new barracks, increased their privileges, and ensured they were always well-fed and well-paid. In exchange, the Praetorians maintained an outward image of discipline. Rome prospered, but beneath the marble facade, corruption fermented. And then came Commodus, the gladiator emperor whose self-indulgence pushed the Guard's power to absurd levels. His Praetorian prefects, first Perennis, then the notorious Cleander, essentially ran the empire. Cleander even sold government offices to the highest bidder, turning Roman politics into a marketplace. The more corrupt Rome became, the richer the Praetorians grew. They stood at the centre of every transaction, every bribe, every whispered scheme. But Commodus's madness eventually threatened their profits. When he began eliminating senators, nobles, and even members of the Guard, they acted. In one of Rome's most infamous nights, a Praetorian conspirator delivered the emperor's final blow in his bath. Commodus died without ceremony, choked by his own protectors. The message was unmistakable. The Praetorians weren't just powerful. They had become the empire's invisible rulers. And soon, their downfall would be as spectacular as their rise. For almost 3 centuries, the Praetorian Guard shaped the fate of the Roman Empire. They had made emperors, murdered emperors, extorted emperors, and, at their worst, auctioned off the imperial throne itself. They were the iron shadow behind Roman politics, feared by senators, adored by opportunists, and courted by kings. But no force that powerful survives forever. By the early 4th century, the Praetorians had pushed their influence too far, accumulating enemies who understood that Rome could never be stable as long as the guard held a dagger to the emperor's throat. Their downfall began during the rule of Diocletian. A master reformer, Diocletian reorganized the empire into the Tetrarchy, 4 emperors ruling together. This system was designed not only to stabilize Rome's borders, but also to weaken the Praetorians' monopoly on power. By dividing authority between multiple rulers and relocating imperial courts away from Rome, he reduced the guards' access to the throne. They still existed, but their glory days were fading. They were no longer kingmakers. They were relics. Then came Constantine. The Praetorians gambled on the wrong man. In the struggle for imperial supremacy after Diocletian's retirement, the guard backed Emperor Maxentius, who promised them restored power and old privileges. They hoped for a return to the days when a single emperor in Rome meant a single chokehold on imperial politics. But Constantine was no helpless puppet. He understood that to rule Rome, he first had to break the institution that had terrorized it for generations. The decisive moment arrived at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. Constantine's forces clashed with Maxentius's army, which was heavily supported by Praetorian troops. When Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, the Praetorians lost not just a battle, but their political identity. Their chosen emperor was dead. Their future evaporated. Constantine entered Rome as a conqueror and a reformer with unfinished business. He marched straight to the Castra Praetoria, the colossal fortress the guard had built as a symbol of dominance, and in an act as symbolic as it was practical, he demolished it. Stone by stone, tower by tower, the very heart of Praetorian power was reduced to rubble. The guard was formally disbanded, their units dissolved, their privileges revoked, their name erased from the imperial structure. Survivors were reassigned to frontier legions, an ironic punishment for soldiers who once refused to serve anywhere outside Rome. The message was brutal and final. The era of the Praetorian Guard was over. Their rise had redefined Roman politics. Their corruption had destabilized the empire, and their fall marked the end of an institution too dangerous to outlive its creators. In the end, the Praetorian Guard protected emperors for centuries, but it was their ambition, not their enemies, that finally destroyed them.